Why is Russia retreating from Kherson? Let's find out more about Russia and their retreat. What do you think about the midterm elections? Elon Musk, global warming? And where is Greta Thunberg in all of this? We're going to find out. Let's take a look.
This video was brought to you by the Daily Briefing. While the front lines in Ukraine have stabilised somewhat, over the last few weeks there's been more and more evidence that the Russians have essentially abandoned the city of Kherson, a regional capital with a pre-war population of 300.
Kherson is kind of like Ukraine's Stalingrad, right? It has a big name to it, a lot of moral, and I think of Kherson, when Kherson goes back to Ukraine, it's going to be a big moral hit, positively and negatively both sides.
100,000 that they captured way back in March. This would be yet another bad result for the Russian army, which hasn't exactly covered itself in glory in this conflict. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the most recent developments on the battlefield, including the Russian withdrawal from Kherson, what might have motivated it, and how this will change.
Kharkov is more to Stalingrad because it's a cursed city of a Russian army.
The trajectory of the war going forward. A quick look at other developments on the battlefield. Now, in our last Ukraine video, we claimed that the front lines have mostly stabilised, and while that's still true, there have nonetheless been a couple of notable developments. Perhaps the most significant event of recent days was the battle for Pavlivka, a small town in southern Donetsk which was retaken by Ukraine back in early July. This part of the front line has been relatively...
Well, legally speaking, under Russian law, under fucking bullshit orc law, this is now annexed territory of Russia, meaning the Ukrainians are, in the view of Vladimir Putin and his propaganda, stepping into Russian territory, which is going to be interesting how Russia reacts to that.
...stable for most of the war, largely because the southeastern part of Donetsk was already under the control of the Donetsk People's Republic before Russia's invasion in February. This means both the DPR and Ukrainian forces have had years to set up defensive lines here, which means offensive advances are more difficult. Most of the fighting in Donetsk has actually occurred in northern Donetsk, where Russian forces have been trying to take Bakhmut on their way to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the two large remaining Ukrainian holdouts in the oblast. The Russians' newfound interest in the area might have something to do with logistics. Since the attack on the Crimean Bridge, which still hasn't been fully repaired...
Yeah, I heard that they are now planning to repair that bridge, just sending pieces of that bridge to East Crimea, and that will be a very, very good target for an attack.
Russia is currently struggling to supply Kherson and occupied territory in southeastern Ukraine. The main route at the moment is rail via Donetsk, but the Ukrainians are currently within firing range of the main rail route, which puts Russia's entire logistic arrangement in the south.
Sounds like they should have already destroyed that railway, man. A lesbian Democrat won in Massachusetts, becoming the first openly LGBTQ governor. That sounds actually kind of good.
Anyway, the Russians have been bombarding Pavlivka with artillery since the Ukrainians recaptured it in July. And a couple of weeks ago,
What's the
they started to advance
Dude,
on the
this is
town.
the flag of superiority.
Originally, it looked like the Russian offensive was successful, and on October the 30th, Russian telegram channels claimed that the Russian forces had taken the town. Ukraine didn't deny the advance, which suggested the Russians really did retake the town. This advance was apparently spearheaded by Kazkad, an elite unit from the DPR. However, a few days later, a Ukrainian counter-offensive threatened to overwhelm the Russians, who duly called for backup. This is when things got really bad for the Russians. In response, Russian command sent in the 155th and 40th Naval Brigades, who suffered massive losses. On Sunday afternoon...
Dude, when this war is over, man, Russia might have lost up to 200,000 young men, man, and that is just... My camera froze? Since when is that a thing?
Nearly a week of fighting, the 155th Brigade sent a letter to Russia's high command asking to retreat, claiming that they'd lost 300 troops and hundreds of vehicles in 4 days. This letter started doing the rounds on Russian military bloggers' Telegram accounts, and it's safe to say weren't happy. It's not entirely clear why things went so badly, and by Monday, Pavlivka was back under Ukrainian control. And if that wasn't bad enough news for the Russians, it also looks like they're going to give up Kherson city. Kherson is the regional capital of the Kherson Oblast, and it had a pre-war population of about 300,000. It was captured by the Russians in early March, and it's the largest city and only regional capital to fall during the war. However, over the past couple of months, Russia's position in Kherson has become increasingly untenable. There are a couple of reasons
You're
for
spamming
this.
a lot of videos, man.
First,
knowing
Ukrainian
it gets
forces have been making progress towards Kherson since early September, when a successful counteroffensive pushed Russian forces down the Dnipro. Second, logistics. As we mentioned a second ago, the attack on the Crimean Bridge has hindered Russia's logistical operation in the south. They're now more reliant on a rail that runs south from Donetsk. But, as Pavlivka demonstrated, Russian forces are unable to protect the rail line from Ukrainian artillery. This is bad enough news for Russian forces in the Kherson Oblast, but it's particularly terrible news for the 20,000 or so in Kherson City, because Kherson City lies on the west side of the Dnipro River. There are only 2 large crossings from the Russian-controlled territory on the east side of the Dnipro over to Russian forces in Kherson City on the west side. The Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson City and the Novokakhovka Dam, which lies just 35 kilometers downstream of the Russian front line at Mylove. As we've explained in previous videos, both of these have...
Zelensky is a modern Winston Churchill. That is the dumbest shit I've read into... Yeah, what? Alter, that you give me... It hurts right here. It's like someone puts a knife in here.
Been bombarded by Ukrainian artillery and now have limited carrying capacity. And this has exacerbated Russia's pre-existing logistical difficulties in Kherson City. The Ukrainians have realized Russia's vulnerability here and have been building up their forces around Kherson in anticipation of another offensive. The Russians have apparently decided that they can't hold on to the city and have started retreating. Russian occupying authorities started evacuating the 60,000...
The worst thing that could ever happen to Ukraine is that the Russians find their IQ, man. You know, I love that guy who said, we're so damn lucky that they're so goddamn stupid, man.
Civilians left in the city in mid-October. And over the weekend, Putin himself encouraged civilians to leave the city. Last week, it was reported that Russian troops themselves were leaving government buildings and checkpoints, and satellite imagery shows that Russian forces are setting up new defensive lines on the west bank of the Dnipro. Analysis of satellite images suggests that the Russians have set up 3 parallel lines of defense on the west side of the Dnipro, which really does suggest they're about to give up Kherson.
Yeah, but then
this is
Ukraine's going to get very stuck
deeply embarrassing for Putin, not least because he apparently annexed Kherson just a few months ago. However, it sort of makes sense because Russia deployed its best troops to the west bank of the Dnipro, and they don't want to lose them. Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate claimed that the most capable Russian troops had been deployed to Kherson, including elite airborne forces known as the VDV.
Like I just told you, man, the one problem Ukraine has is Russians that can actually count to 10, man. True story.
If Russia's elite units were decimated, it would be terrible news, not just for the Russian capacity, but also morale. Nonetheless, the loss of Kherson would be undeniably bad news for the Russians, and it won't go down well with the Russian nationalists or the Russian public. Russian nationalists have criticised Putin for not being aggressive enough, and the Russian public's enthusiasm for the war has waned since Putin's partial mobilization. According to the Levada Center, the most credible polling institute in Russia, while public support for the armed forces and Putin personally remains high, an increasing faction of the Russian public wants the Kremlin to open peace negotiations. The latest polling from October suggests that 57% of the public want to start peace negotiations, while just 36% want the war to continue. This is up from September, when 48% wanted peace, while 44% wanted the war to continue.
4 minutes ago, Kirill Ork, deputy head of Russian-occupied Kherson region, has died in an accident.
All in all, things aren't looking good for Putin or the Kremlin. If you want to be updated with this story as it happens, subscribe to the channel.
Good news, very, very good news.